Let's toss things now over to News 12's Jody Juliana Powell, who spoke with the family of the 17-year-old victim that was shot in the head as she's fighting for her life in the hospital.
I spoke to her mother, and she tells me her daughter's name is Anthonaya Campbell. And Campbell's family sat outside most of the day watching over the crime scene from their house just across the street from the park as they prayed for Anthonaya to pull through.
It's heartbreaking. You don't give birth to your children in order to see them on a trach. And
on a warm summer day in the Bronx, families gathered at Hartford Park for what should have been a celebration. A neighborhood basketball tournament meant to unite the Bronx ended in chaos when gunfire turned joy into terror. 17-year-old Anthonaya Campbell was struck in the face by a bullet. Though she fought for weeks in the hospital, her battle would end in tragedy. Police later said it was gang-related violence that claimed an innocent life. But who was Anthonaya, and what does her death reveal about America's growing gun violence crisis? In this story, we uncover the life, the tragedy, and the painful questions her death leaves behind. Before her name appeared in police and news headlines, Anthonaya Campbell was a teenager with dreams, friendships, and a future that should have lasted for decades. At just 17 years old, Anthonaya was navigating the challenges that come with adolescence in urban America, balancing school, relationships, and the daily realities of life in the Bronx. According to community memorial pages and statements from those who knew her, Anthonaya was remembered as more than just another teenager. Friends and family described her as kind, loved, and deeply missed by all who knew her. Her mother, who would later become a vocal advocate during Anthonaya's hospitalization, spoke of her daughter with the fierce love that only a parent possesses.
Campbell's mother, Jennifer, holding back tears. She says her daughter got a blood transfusion this morning. Jennifer says they were visiting from Hartford, Connecticut. They used to live in the neighborhood and were back to see family.
What stands out most in the aftermath of Anthonaya's death is the community's response. Social media is filled with tributes from friends expressing disbelief and grief. Church members rallied around the family, offering prayers and support. These spontaneous expressions of mourning showed something deeper. A community refusing to let a young life be reduced to a statistic, insisting that Anthonaya Campbell mattered, that her life had value beyond the circumstances of her death. Much of Anthonaya's life remains private, as her family faced public grief during their most painful moment. Her future, college, career, family, was stolen in seconds that summer afternoon. Understanding who Anthonaya was requires recognizing not just what was taken, but what could have been. The day Anthonaya went to Hartford Park, she had no way of knowing that gang violence brewing in Bronx neighborhoods was about to shatter her world and her life. Hartford Park sits in the northeast Bronx, serving as a vital community gathering point in a densely populated urban neighborhood. The park's basketball courts regularly host tournaments that bring together players and spectators from across the borough, events that strengthen community bonds and provide positive outlets for young people. These tournaments aren't just athletic competitions, they're social events where neighbors reconnect, where local talent gets recognized, and where communities affirm their identity. On that fateful summer day, the park was filled with exactly this kind of positive energy.
So it's kind of like an ironic disaster.
She says her daughter was in the park watching a back-to-school basketball tournament advertised on Instagram.
But beneath this surface normalcy, tensions that had nothing to do with basketball were about to explode. Police later said gang tensions erupted that day, turning a community event into a deadly crossfire. Without warning, gunshots shattered the afternoon calm. Multiple shots were fired in rapid succession as panic immediately seized the crowd. Witnesses described chaos as families ran and players dove for cover. When the shooting stopped and first responders arrived, the true scope of the tragedy became horrifyingly clear. 32-year-old Jaceel Banks died instantly, and several others were wounded. But the injury that would ultimately claim the most attention belonged to Anthonaya Campbell. The 17-year-old had been struck in the face by a bullet, a catastrophic injury that was immediately recognized as life-threatening. Witnesses watched in horror as emergency responders worked frantically to stabilize her condition before rushing her to the hospital. Anthonaya was transported to NYC Health Plus Hospital's Jacoby, Jacoby, a level 1 trauma center in the Bronx equipped to handle the most serious injuries. There, medical teams would begin a desperate fight to save her life, a fight that would continue for weeks and become the subject of painful controversy. The medical teams performed emergency surgeries, attempting to repair the massive damage and stabilize her condition. She was placed on life support as doctors monitored her neurological status, knowing that her chances of survival were slim. NYPD officers flooded Haffen Park, immediately securing the crime scene and beginning the complex work of investigating a mass shooting in a crowded public space. Detectives collected shell casings, interviewed traumatized witnesses, and reviewed surveillance footage from the park and surrounding areas. The challenge was immense, getting coherent statements from people who had just experienced terror, piecing together what happened in those chaotic seconds. However, investigators quickly developed leads and a working theory. According to NYPD statements reported by local news outlets, including ABC 7 New York and Hoodline, the shooting was believed to be gang-related, not random violence, but rather a targeted attack connected to ongoing conflicts between rival groups. The basketball tournament, a public gathering with predictable attendees, may have provided an opportunity for violence that had been planned or anticipated. If community events can become battlegrounds for criminal organizations, how can families feel safe participating in neighborhood activities? The shooting highlighted the way gang violence creates ripple effects far beyond its intended targets, turning innocent bystanders into victims and entire communities into collateral damage. As investigators worked to build their case against the suspects, Anthonaya Campbell remained hospitalized in critical condition, fighting for her life. But her battle would soon become complicated by controversies over the medical care she was receiving. Following the shooting, trauma surgeons at Jacoby Medical Center immediately began emergency procedures to address Anthonaya's catastrophic injuries. A gunshot to the face is among the most devastating injuries, often involving severe brain and facial trauma. Medical teams performed surgeries attempting to repair the damage and stabilize Anthonaya's condition. She was placed on life support as doctors monitored her neurological status and worked to control the injury's immediate effects. For her family, these became weeks of agonizing uncertainty, sitting in hospital waiting rooms, receiving updates from medical staff, watching their daughter fight for every breath, and praying for improvement that never seemed to come.
Bullets started flying, with one hitting Anthonaya Campbell in the back of her head as she watched the game from the bleachers.
Beyond the hospital walls, Anthonaya's community rallied around her family during these agonizing weeks. Church members organized prayer vigils, friends maintained constant social media updates asking for prayers and support, and neighbors expressed outrage over the shooting that had put this young woman in such a terrible situation. The public dimension of Anthonaya's fight highlighted how urban gun violence creates collective trauma. This wasn't just one family's tragedy, but a community watching one of their own suffer, feeling helpless to change the outcome. Despite weeks of medical care, despite her family's passionate advocacy, despite the prayers and support of an entire community, Anthonaya Campbell ultimately succumbed to her injuries. The girl who had gone to watch basketball at her neighborhood park became the second fatality of the Haffen Park shooting. Her death transformed the legal landscape of the case and left her family to grapple with both grief and unanswered questions about whether different medical care might have saved her life. With Anthonaya's death, legal proceedings against her alleged killers took on new weight. What had been attempted murder charges now became murder charges, and prosecutors faced the task of seeking justice for 2 lives lost to senseless gang violence. After Anthonaya's death, prosecutors upgraded charges to murder, using ballistics, eyewitnesses, and surveillance to build their case. Eyewitness testimony would be crucial, though obtaining reliable statements from a chaotic mass shooting presents significant challenges as traumatized observers struggle to recall precise details. Surveillance footage from the park or nearby locations could provide objective documentation of the shooting. And importantly, investigators analyzed the gang dynamics underlying the attack to establish motive and demonstrate that this was premeditated violence rather than an impulsive action. According to reports, multiple suspects of various ages were arrested and charged with serious offenses, including murder.
She said the park is packed on the weekends with kids having a good time. She grew up around Hartford Park and never expected this mass shooting.
The Bronx, despite overall crime reductions in New York City compared to historical peaks, continues to struggle with gun violence, particularly affecting young people and communities of color. Cycles of gang retaliation, poverty, limited opportunity, and easy gun access keep violence alive in the Bronx. Inadequate schools limit futures, reducing motivation to avoid risky behavior. Easy access to firearms. Despite New York's relatively strict gun laws, weapons flow into the city through trafficking from states with looser regulations, ensures that conflicts escalate from fists to bullets. Trauma compounds across generations, with young people who witness violence becoming more likely to engage in violence themselves. Social media has also changed the landscape of youth conflict. Disputes that once might have remained between individuals now play out publicly online, with perceived disrespect demanding public response. Local groups use violence interrupters, youth programs, and job training to give teens safer paths forward. Trauma counseling helps young people process the violence they've witnessed and experienced. These programs show promise, but they require sustained funding and community support. Prevention needs steady support, not attention only when tragedy strikes. Effective intervention requires long-term commitment, recognizing that changing community conditions takes years of consistent effort and investment in young people before violence occurs, rather than simply responding after it happens. For Anthonaya's friends and peers who witnessed the shooting or knew her, the trauma will have lasting effects. Studies consistently show that witnessing violence, particularly the violent death of friends, creates lasting psychological impacts, including depression, anxiety, PTSD, and increased risk of future violence involvement. Preventing another tragedy, like Anthonaya's, means tackling root causes, poverty, trauma, and easy gun access through long-term community investment. Final ending. Anthonaya Campbell was 17 years old. She had decades ahead of her: college, career, family, dreams fulfilled. Instead, her life ended at a basketball court, cut down by gang violence that had nothing to do with her. Her death joins too many others, forming a devastating pattern of innocent lives stolen. If you have information about the Hartford Park shooting, contact the NYPD or Crime Stoppers at 1-800-577-TIPS. Help bring justice for Anthonaya and her family. Share this story to keep her memory alive and demand change.